Well, hey everybody, this is Robert, and welcome to today's show. Now, a bottlenecker is a person who advocates for the creation or perpetuation of government regulation, particularly an occupational license, to restrict entry into his or her occupation, thereby accruing an economic advantage without a benefit to consumers. Now, on today's show, I want to look at bottleneckers, in particular, occupational licensure. So joining me today is the Director of Strategic Research at the Institute of Justice and a professor at the University of Colorado and the co-author of a very important book, Bottleneckers, Gaming the Government for Power and Private Profit. Please welcome Dick Carpenter, PhD. Dr. Carpenter, welcome to the show, sir.
Thank you. My pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
You bet. Well, let me first comment on the book, Bottleneckers. Really enjoyed it, and I don't believe I've heard anyone take such a critical look at occupational license since decades ago when Milton Friedman did. So hopefully that's a compliment.
It is. Thank you.
Yeah. So why Bottleneckers, and what made you decide to write this book?
Well, the name Bottleneckers is drawn from the well-known metaphor of a bottleneck, something that restricts free flow and free movement into whatever. So we think of a bottleneck in traffic, for instance, and the consequences that come from that. And we wanted to use that metaphor to help people understand what occupational licensing does. It restricts workers into occupations, so it creates a bottleneck of people who might enter an occupation, and it comes with some economic ills like fewer jobs and higher prices. And so that metaphor is a way to help people understand how these licenses function. And the reason that we decided to write the book was we have been working on this issue going back to our founding. IJ, the Institute for Justice, was founded in 1991. And one of the very first cases, actually the first several cases, were on the issue of economic liberty, specifically occupational licensing. And along the way, all these years that we have noticed that there is a myth that prevails about occupational licensing, and the myth is that licenses are created by legislators at the request of consumers who are harmed and they want protection. When in fact, licenses are created by legislators at the request of those in the industry to be licensed. And for many people, this is somewhat counterintuitive. It seems absurd. Why would anyone ask for more government intrusion into their business? But once we realize why, then it makes more sense. And the why, of course, is that licenses act as a bottleneck and keep competitors out so that those who are in the industry can enjoy economic benefits as a result. So we really wanted to help people come to understand what the real dynamic is and how these licenses are really created, and that metaphor, that bottleneck, we felt captured that dynamic.
Yeah. So an occupational license, if we were to define it, it's basically government permission to do a job.
Yeah, it's a government permission slip to work. That's exactly what it is. So before you can work in a licensed occupation, you have to satisfy the government. You don't have to satisfy a potential consumer. You don't have to satisfy a potential employer. You have to satisfy the government in order to get permission in order to do that work.
Now, depending on the state, all the states are somewhat different. An occupational license may be required to work in numerous jobs ranging from everything, hair braiders to florists to tour guides and every other job in between. So the reach is really vast. There's no doubt about that. Dr. Carpenter, generally it is thought that America had started as a free nation. So how did we end up regulating so many jobs and vocations?
This actually goes back quite a number of years, much further than people realize. In the United States, licensing actually goes back to the 19th century, and it's even before that as well. But here in the U.S., we started to see licenses pop up in the late 19th century, and it was helped along by some important, maybe some infamous Supreme Court decisions that essentially said it was perfectly okay, didn't violate anyone's constitutional right if the state were to grant licenses or monopolies in particular economic spheres, in particular jobs. And so with that, the path was cleared for professional associations to go to the legislature and ask for a license. If the courts weren't going to engage it seriously, then what it was left to was the legislature to be a stop. But in fact, the legislature is not a stop. Often the legislature is all too willing to allow these licenses to be created or to create them at the request of those in the industry. And they're willing to do so because these are individuals who basically are operating as a constituency or will operate as a constituency. It's kind of an implicit quid pro quo where the group that wants to be licensed goes in and demands or asks for the license. The elected official says, okay, I'll grant you the license with the implicit expectation that you will support me in the future. So there's kind of a relationship there in the ask. And so over the years, an increasing number of occupational or leaders in industries have come to recognize how a license can be economically beneficial, and they have learned from each other in going to the legislature and asking for a license.
Yeah, and the states clearly must get a lot of revenue through this also.
Well, that's what you would think. But they very likely don't get as much as people expect. Most of these licenses are funded by the fees that potential or aspiring license holders have to pay. And depending on what the particular occupation is, that might generate a fair amount of revenue, but that revenue then has to be turned around to pay for all the regulatory costs that are associated with maintaining the license, the board, the inspectors, all the day-to-day operations. So it's not really a big revenue generator, but it does come with significant costs to members of the community, consumers, for instance, and other forms.
Yeah. Now, you've been studying this for quite some time. Is there any occupational licensure that you're fine with?
The way we like to say it is we are certainly open to the fact that, or the idea anyway, that certain occupations could benefit from some form of government intervention. But we start from the premise that people should be free to practice their occupation without government intervention until it is shown with empirical systematic evidence that some form of government intervention is necessary. And if that hurdle can be cleared, then it makes sense to have some form of government intervention. But until then, people should be free to practice their occupation without any form of government intervention. And I think it's important to note that there are, when I keep saying government intervention because there are alternatives that don't require a full license, but still can have the benefits of licensing and take the form of government intervention. Things like mandatory bonding and insurance, inspections, registration, certification. These are all different types of government interventions that don't have the costs associated with the licensing, but can come with some of the same benefits.
So what are the effects of bottlenecking, both on the individuals and on the economy in general?
Well, for the individual, it increases the difficulty of getting into a particular job. So licensing, it's one of the rare public policies that actually accomplishes what it intends to do. It keeps people out. It makes it harder for people to enter jobs. It makes it harder for employers to find people to work in their jobs. It also retards innovation because licensing doesn't reward innovation, it rewards standardization. So it has the potential to retard innovation. So for the worker, there are costs in reducing job opportunities. For consumers, it comes in the form of higher consumer costs, and there is a growing amount of research demonstrating this. And that's because once you earn the license, you pay a significant amount to get the license. Once you've earned it, now you have the ability to charge more artificially than you would otherwise. So there's a wage premium, and that wage premium is passed on to consumers. So consumers will pay more for the goods and services of licensed individuals as compared to places where there is a freer market or a more open market. So consumers will pay as much, and there are different types of costs. We had a report that came out just a few months ago that actually quantified costs, and there are several different types worth mentioning. The first is the lost economic output that comes as a result of licensing. That is somewhere in the neighborhood of $6 to $7 billion a year.
Wow.
It's called a deadweight loss. Another form is misallocation costs. And misallocation costs comes in somewhere approaching $200 billion a year. And you can think of misallocation cost as in two forms. One is the consumer would like to buy a good or a service, but cannot do so because his or her money has to be dedicated to paying for the higher prices that come with a licensed good or service. Another form of misallocation cost is that somebody who could do a certain job is restricted from doing so because she doesn't have the wherewithal to earn the license. And so consequently, she ends up doing some other job that she's not as skilled at doing or may not be as interested in doing. And so that's a form of misallocation cost. And as I mentioned earlier, of course, there are fewer job opportunities. And so the estimate is there are somewhere around 2 million fewer jobs each year as a result of licensing.
Well, that's amazing. And regulations and requirements vary from state to state. Some are worse than others. And what states are the worst concerning occupational license?
So we had a report that came out, the second edition of our report came out last year called License to Work, in which we actually quantified the burdens associated with licensing in 102 low to moderate income occupations in all 50 states. And we discovered that when you look at, across the states, when you look at both the number of those occupations that were licensed and how burdensome those licensing requirements are, the states that rose to the top as being the worst were California, Nevada, Arkansas, and Hawaii. So these are states that widely licensed the occupations that we studied and also had licensing requirements that were very burdensome to enter.
And what would be the best states?
Best states, those that were at the bottom of the list, and by bottom we of course mean they didn't regulate as many of the occupations that we studied, and the burdens associated with those particular occupations were not as severe. So when we looked at those particular types of metrics, the states that were the best were Wyoming, Vermont, Montana, South Dakota, and Colorado.
Now, is there any evidence that occupational licensure improves quality or reduces hazards? Are there any demonstrated benefits of the license?
There's very little evidence to that effect, and that's what people find so surprising because it seems to make logical or intuitive sense. A license would restrict entry, it would weed out charlatans and quacks and people with lower skill, and therefore it should result in higher quality of service. When in fact the evidence to that is very scarce. There are a few articles in a couple of occupations, midwives being one of them, that seem to suggest there might be improvement in quality of service, but by and large, study after study that looks for improved quality of service just fails to find it.
Now, one of the professions that are often used to illustrate government overreach and occupational protectionism is that of hair braiders. I've heard this story 100 times. And you, in the book, you and your co-author write of the story of Justina Clayton. It's a quite interesting story. Can you share with the audience Justina's story and her battle with bottlenecking?
Yes. Justina is a hair braider living in Utah, but she is not originally from Utah. In fact, she's originally from Sierra Leone. She was born and raised in Sierra Leone during the time that it was under great warfare. And so she spent the first 9 of her 11 years basically just surviving. She lived in refugee camps. She narrowly escaped being kidnapped multiple times. And so her early life was extremely, extremely difficult. And her mother, fearing for her safety, her mother eventually directed her to go and track down a relative that lived in the United States get a visa so that she could go to the United States, and that's how she ended up here. First living with her aunt in New York. Eventually she married and moved to Utah, where her husband's family lived and continues to live. And so when they moved to Utah, she enrolled in school, and her husband enrolled in school at the same time. They started a family, and they discovered that the costs associated with raising their family and going to school were more than what they were able to take in through the jobs that they were able to maintain. And so Justina began looking around for ways that she could try to increase her income, but also continue to maintain her family, raise her children. And she hit upon the idea of braiding hair. Now, this is something that Justina had learned as a child. It's very cultural in Africa. And so she learned how to braid hair there. She continued to braid hair when she was in the United States, and when she made her way to Utah, she thought, you know what, I could actually braid hair. And it was the perfect opportunity because at that time there was an increasing number of people in the small city that she lived in who were adopting children from Africa. And so she sensed there was a market, a way for her to serve a need in the community. A lot of these adopting parents just didn't know how to maintain their child's hair, their adopted African child's hair, and so they were looking for somebody who would help them. Justina could help them, and so she began offering her services. She picked up clients very quickly. She was very good at it, and everything was going along really swimmingly until she was contacted. Sorry?
And then?
And then she was contacted by somebody who noticed that she was offering these services and said, if you don't stop doing, I understand you are not licensed as a cosmetologist, and if you don't stop doing this, then I will report you to the State Board of Cosmetology. Utah at the time, like other states, required that if you were going to work as a hair braider, you had to have a cosmetology license, even though hair braiding is not cosmetology. It doesn't use chemicals, it doesn't cut hair, it doesn't color hair, it doesn't perm hair, it just braids. That's all it is. It's just hair braiding. But nonetheless, the Bottleneckers had been successful in having hair braiding covered under the cosmetology law. Well, Justina thought this was absolutely crazy. So she went to the board and she tried to make her case for why a cosmetology license was unnecessary. Well, not surprisingly, they were unreceptive, largely because cosmetology boards are populated by cosmetologists. So then she partnered with one of her, somebody in that community who had adopted African children, a state legislator, and she went to the state legislature to try to have the hair braiding requirement removed from the cosmetology license. Well, there she got a lesson in how bottleneckers work. The cosmetology industry marshaled an enormous number of cosmetologists and cosmetology students to go to the legislature and to lobby aggressively to protect the licensing requirement for hair braiders. So basically it was Justina and that state legislator versus scores, if not hundreds, of licensed cosmetologists or aspiring cosmetologists who were lobbying to protect that license. And not surprisingly, the cosmetologists won the day.
Yeah.
But Justina was not satisfied, and so she brought a lawsuit against the state, and we represented her in that lawsuit because IJ is a nonprofit law firm. So we represented her, and eventually, through all the trials and so forth, we were victorious. And so the judge found in favor of Justina, saying there was no rational reason for a cosmetology license to braid hair. And so now Justina and others are free to do so.
That's great. Now, I take it that's probably a rarity, though. How often does an individual actually win a fight like that against the system?
It is, as you said, unfortunately rare.
Yeah.
We have represented individuals in various different occupations, not just hair braiding, but casket selling and florists, taxi drivers, all kinds of different occupations that require a license. And we have a winning record. We win across all of our different types of cases. We win more than 70% of the time. But when it comes to licensing, this is a difficult uphill climb because of all the legal precedent that has been set in the decades before. So unfortunately, many do not win, but we have seen an uptick in the number of cases that we have been able to win in recent years. So we think the momentum is working in our favor. This is not to say that everything is rosy. There's still an enormous amount of work to do and a lot of hurdles to clear, but we're starting to see early good traction.
Now, are there any things that could be done to reverse this trend, or is it just case by case by case?
Well, in litigation, it is largely case by case by case. We also work in the legislature as well, so we are trying to make changes within legislatures. So we have a multi-front attack on licensing. So what can be done? Number one, we continue to bring lawsuits, and with wins, particularly if these are wins at the Court of Appeals or even higher, then the results can have wide-ranging effects, positive effects. In the legislature, we have had wins there as well, where states have either eliminated licenses altogether or they have adopted forms of bills that make it much more difficult to adopt licenses to begin with. So we're starting to see wins in the legislature. So what needs to happen is more of that, more skepticism by legislators when bottleneckers go in and ask for licenses, more skepticism by legislators when bottleneckers go and ask to protect an existing license. And we also need legislators to take seriously their oversight role, so that when these bottleneckers go in and ask for a license, they don't accept the arguments on their face. Because the bottleneckers, when they ask for the license, they're not bringing in empirical evidence that there's a significant threat to public health and safety. They're largely taking anecdotes in there. And so legislators need to take their jobs very seriously in requiring or demanding that type of evidence before they impose upon the right to earn an honest living.
Well, again, the book is called Bottleneckers, Gaming the Government for Power and Private Profit. Dr. Carpenter, any final thoughts on this topic?
Well, we talked just a little bit about alternatives to licensing, and this is in answer to your prior question, what can be done. This is a systematic, structured way that legislators can think about occupational licensing, that if some form of government intervention is necessary, it does not have to be a license. There are alternatives that legislators can consider, and of course, there is the alternative of no government intervention at all. And the reason I say this is because many, if not most, jobs today in the United States are unlicensed. Yes, there has been an increase in the number of occupations requiring a license. In the 1950s, there was about 5% of workers that need a license. Today, it's between 20 and 30% of workers that need a license. So there has been a significant increase. But there's still a large number of people who don't need a license to work and a large number of occupations that do not. And they are able to do so without significant threats to public health and safety. So I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. A second thing that is important to keep in mind is that the licensing requirements are often disparate, very disparate from one state to another, where often an occupation may be licensed in a few states but unlicensed in most of them. Or conversely, there may be 30 states that license a particular occupation, leaving 20 states in D.C. that don't. That strongly suggests that a license in those licensed states just simply is not necessary. So I think it's an important thing to note that people have this impression that licensing of particular occupations may be ubiquitous, but in fact it's not. And the fact that it's not suggests that license very likely may not be necessary in the places that it is.
Interesting point. Well, I wanted to thank you, Dr. Dick Carpenter, for spending the time with me today to talk about this issue. I appreciate it.
Oh, happy to do it. Thanks for taking this issue on.
You bet. Thank you.